Gayle McDowell, I have your book right here. I bought this bad boy 9 years ago. You can see I've taken notes. I have worn down this book, and I think there are many, many other PMs and aspiring PMs have done the same, and they've probably come up to you afterwards, after reading the book. What are the biggest misconceptions people have after reading your book about cracking the PM interview?
I think one of the big things is that people do too much preparation in this very like solo style thing of I'm going to take a question and I'm going to write down my answer, which is usually a mistake. Um, and they prepare in this very solo way. I always encourage people if you can do mock interviews, like please do them. It doesn't have to be a professional thing. I'm sure there's lots of companies doing it, but even just getting a friend to do a mock interview with you, like interviews are interactive and you need to simulate that environment. And even short of that, like a simple thing like record yourself doing doing your preparation. The reason why is one of the things I notice when I'm preparing people is people have no idea how long they're speaking for. I'll tell them, hey, keep your pitch to 2 minutes, and they'll speak for 8 minutes and just have no idea. And so I tell people, forget about timing things, but actually record instead of timing yourself, record yourself. Because if you record yourself, you have the timing and you know how you spent different amounts of time. So record your mock interviews, even if it's just you yourself doing it, record.
So would there kind of be a hierarchy of practice? Reading at the lowest level, writing out your answer above that, recording your answer above that, mock interview with a friend above that, and then maybe mock interview with an expert or a former interviewer at the very top?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the best possible world is to be doing mock interviews with, actual people working, really a dream world for the company you're interviewing with. Realistically, there's only so many of those you can do. And you're going to get, the most value from that, from those limited opportunities you have by doing a bunch of preparation on your own. With that said, I caution people. I don't want to say prohibit it, but I caution people from writing down answers because one, it's a super time consuming way of doing that, of doing preparation. You only have so many hours in the day. And it gets people, especially because our interviews are primarily remote nowadays, it sometimes people start using kind of interviewing really with their like written out answers in front of them and they get this kind of disaster thing. So I would encourage people instead to not write down their answers word for word. Make sort of an outline though. That's a reasonable thing to do so that when you do, when you start recording yourself, when you start doing mock interviews and, and eventually real interviews, you are really well prepared to do those and get the most value out of those.
So somebody's taken our advice, they're recording themselves, they're doing mock interviews. What are the big mistakes people make when recording themselves or doing mock interviews?
Um, so a lot of it's very, very succinct. But I think one thing is that there are sort of two ways of preparing, or two kind of ways of thinking about preparing. One is, and one of the things a lot of people do is they are like, okay, well, I'm going to come up with my sort of 5 or 10 key stories. Sometimes less than five, but I'm going to come up with a few key stories and I'm going to practice those. That's great. Fine. Go ahead and do that. I'm not saying don't do that. But when you actually do the real interviews, you're not being told, okay, now tell me your next story. And so you can do that if it helps you, but remember that in the actual interview, you need to match that story to what the actual question is. And it's not, and depending on the question, you may need to change that answer. And so what can happen is people actually put so much focus on preparing and lose sight of that they need to match that question. They need to tweak their answer depending on what is actually being asked of them. And sometimes depending on the actual company, what one company looks for can be different than another. And that same story about, building XYZ feature and falling behind schedule, you may have that one story, but it's a very different the what you're actually talking about may change dramatically depending on the company, the specific question being asked, et cetera.
So start with a question instead of starting with a story. Start with a question and practice sculpting your story into that question's answer.
Yeah, and one of the things I like to talk about with people is that I actually think is really important for people to understand is what are interviewers actually looking for? And I think one of the challenges is that candidates think of questions as was this a good answer? Was this a bad answer? And some interviewers aren't looking at things that simplistically, but a lot of interviewers have a more sophisticated way of thinking about it.
Today's episode is brought to you by Maven. The problem with most courses online, like Udemy, is there's no live component, and the instructors aren't experts in their fields, they're professors. At Maven, you get direct live access to experts and operators from the world's best tech companies. You can't get that access anywhere else, in any university, and you usually can't find them on YouTube either. I've featured so many of Maven's experts in the newsletter and podcast for that reason. To help you out, I've put together a collection of courses I recommend at maven.com/x/Aakash. This includes courses like AI prototyping for PMs, product sense for PMs, and getting an AI PM certification. Visit it now at maven.com/x/AAKASH.
So one of the things I do in addition to my books is I work with companies on their hiring process. And I've actually constructed the product manager hiring process for a whole bunch of big tech companies. And one of the things we talk about there is that you're not evaluating candidates on was this a good answer or a bad answer. What you're trying to do ultimately is figure out who you want to hire. And so what that means that you need to think about what are you actually learning them? What is the signal? So signal is not, I built this thing and it's good or it's bad. Signal is this person has a lot of initiative. They're willing to take risks. They're not willing to take risks. They are very data driven, etc. And so when you think about your answer, you want to think about what attributes are you trying to sell about yourself? And so your story is not, I'm just going to walk through what happened with this feature, but it's, I'm crafting a message for my interviewer about who I am, what I can do, what I can bring to their company. And what message you are crafting there is going to change based on, of course, the situation you're talking about. It's going to change based on exactly how they answer the question. And it's also going to change based on what that company is looking for as well.
What I often address candidates to do when they think about this layer behind the words they actually say, but how those words are interpreted, is to think about what are your glaring weaknesses going into it. If you, for instance, you have had a 3-year job gap and you haven't been working, they'll want to know how interested and how ready are you to work. And so you want to infuse that in. Or if maybe you weren't a PM in your last role, maybe you did a product analytics role and you're trying to come back into PM, they want to understand why you want to come back into PM. I think that to really get that deeper layer of what is a specifically good response for me, people have to be really aware of their weaknesses.
And so, when we think about we talk about the product manager pitch, so your intro. What I like to do is like to think about this framework of who are you? What are what do you bring to the table? What does your company need? And then what are the assumptions people are going to make about you? So I remember a candidate was preparing for interviews, and they had they were CEO of a one-person company. And that was actually in the process of getting acquired. So they were actually going through acquisition interviews. And it was this really beautiful product that, of course, hadn't done super well because it was actually an acqui-hire situation, but it was a very beautiful product. This person had a, art degree and I think some sort of graduate degree in UI or UX. And they built this really beautiful product. And you listen to how this CEO was first telling the story about sort of his background, and it's like, I build beautiful things. And that's great. But he wasn't interviewing for a UX position or UI position. He was interviewing for product management. And unless you're interviewing for a very specific type of role, that's not really, really, really what the company probably wants. Furthermore, when you look at his background, there is no way you can walk away from this person, from hearing anything with the background, and I can build beautiful things. The assumptions people are going to make is, okay, you can build beautiful things, but can you do numbers? Can you do strategy? Can you do these other things? And so I worked with him to totally shift his pitch to effectively tone down the art thing. It's not that that's bad in any way, it's that we wanted to use that time elsewhere and really focus on with with his pitch, with his stories, like, here are the numbers behind what I did. Here's the strategy. Here's this. And it shifted it from I can build beautiful things to like, I'm this awesome product manager who has all this leadership, all this execution, all this strategy, and also I can build things that are beautiful. And it became this really well-rounded story rather than a very narrow story. But it takes understanding in this very realistic way, like, what are the assumptions people are going to make about you?
What are the assumptions people are going to make about you? That is a beautiful, specific example. Now I want to go into a deep dive into behavioral questions for folks. And we have to start with the most famous behavioral interview question of all, probably asked at the beginning of 90% of interviews. Tell me about yourself. How should you answer, tell me about yourself?
So first thing, um, this is it is so common. Like, this is the thing that you want to prepare. Um, and never open PM interview or really any interview with that being prepared. So a very natural flow, and this is where a lot of people's sort of process about this question stops, is you introduce you kind of say, here's where I am right now. I'm a product manager for XYZ company, XYZ team. And then you step back to the beginning and walk through your resume from there. That's kind of the standard flow. It's a good one. It's the kind of the thing I like to just call out here is sometimes people start with where they are now and they start working backwards from there, and it gets this reverse story that's really, really bad. Or they start from the very front and they just go forward from there. So I would avoid both of those approaches and start from where you are right now, hop back to the beginning and work forward. So that's a really, really simple level of it. And that's a good framework, but we want to do a lot more than that. And what I want people to think about is what I mentioned earlier, which is, okay, what are you actually trying to tell me about yourself? And one of the things I actually encourage people to do is to actually think about stereotypes. And I don't necessarily mean racial or gender stereotypes, I hope. But what I mean is stereotypes about you. So if you have, as I mentioned, that other guy, if you have a lot of art in your background, like, make sure you can complement that um, with, talk about numbers and data and strategy and that kind of stuff. If you are coming from, this is your first PM role, and you're coming from a, very technical side, you don't need to sell your technical skills. It's not that those don't matter, but you don't need to sell those because everybody knows that you're technical because you're an engineer. Instead, you need to sell not even really numbers as much. You need to sell that you are a person who thinks about the user, because their stereotype is that coders don't think about users and they don't think about strategy and that kind of thing. And so really think about who you are and how can you show yourself to be something closer to what that company is actually looking for. And then you want to work those things in. You don't, particularly if you have a lot of experience, you do not need to walk through your entire resume. That is usually throwing a lot of information that the interviewer doesn't really care. Well, you want to think about what are kind of your strengths? What are the key things you want to sell yourself? Match that not just to who you are and your stereotypes, match that to what the company might need. A lot of companies have you can look at the job description. You can also look at the company values. Both of those can be good clues as to what you might want to sell about yourself. And then you want to blend those into a story. And in some cases, I've seen some really compelling stories where candidates actually make it pretty explicit. It might be saying, product manager such and such company. And, one of the things that brought me into product management is that I really love thinking about how do we make beautiful things. I am a person, and so people can actually get fairly direct in saying, like, these are the things I want you to learn about me. Usually not with those words, but you can get pretty close to that. And those can be some really, really compelling answers because at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're really selling to the interviewer, like, Your interviewer is going to walk away saying, I get who this person is, get what value they're going to bring to the team.
Awesome. And then the next question that people should be preparing, in my opinion, is something around failures, something around weaknesses. Sometimes it's what's your biggest weakness, what's your biggest three weaknesses, what's a recent product failure. How do you address these negative category of questions?
Yeah. So the weaknesses and, failures are really interesting because they are sometimes answered in very different ways and sometimes they're not. First thing I want to say is that, I think there's been a lot of pushback as interviewing has become more formalized. There's been a lot more research around interviewing about don't ask strengths and weaknesses anymore. Which I actually, as someone who does interviewer training, I fully agree with. At the same time, to candidates, I'll still say, prepare for questions about your weaknesses because even if they aren't asked, it's actually really useful to think about stuff because that goes into a lot of like, who are you? How are you going to sell yourself, et cetera. So even though it may not be asked, prepare strengths and weaknesses. But with the weakness and failures, the I do a lot of interviewer trainings, I mentioned, and I ask interviewers, what are you looking for in this? And one thing I'll note is that people actually give me a lot of different answers, which shows that interviewers are not actually totally consolidated on this is why I'm asked this question. But the most consistent thing is that interviewers want you to give a real answer. That is something many interviewers are specifically looking for. They want a weakness that's real. They want a failure that's real. And so now, of course, you don't want to be too damning. That if you said that your weakness is a lack of integrity, like that's going to be a pretty hard thing to recover from. But you do want a genuine weakness. But you want to think about how can you, and same thing with failure. How can you sort of mitigate? So, for me, what I would personally say is that one of my weaknesses is I don't, and what company I would give this for depends. I wouldn't give this for all companies, but a genuine weakness of mine is that I don't have a strong attention to detail. I'm more focused on, I tend to be somebody who executes quickly, and I do sometimes make careless mistakes. And one of the things I've learned is just, hey, look, this is who I am. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's actually a very good thing, but sometimes it's really when I write books, there's, not that everything's perfect, but like you got to get things you really don't want to start giving people advice that's technically and so I've learned to mitigate it by doing X, Y, and Z. And that's what I want people to think about is look, you think try to give genuine answers here because that's what the interviewer is looking for. That's what's gonna come off the most positive is something that's genuine. But you need to think about what is the mitigation strategy. And same thing with failures is okay, here's my failure, and then how am I mitigating? Which in the case of failures is gonna be about like what did I learn from it? How did I address that in the future?
So people listening, they might be nodding their heads saying, I've read Akash's content. I've read Gayle's book. I've learned this already. So I want to make this real for people. I'm going to put my own neck on the line. You guys can criticize my answers. Let's go ahead and assume that this is still January 2024 when I was a VP of product at Apollo.io. Now I'm a full-time creator. Let's just assume it's still January 2024. I had 16 years of product management experience, so I'm pretty much qualified for the group product manager role at Google. And Google is hiring for the AdWords team, specifically on their self-serve motion. So I'd love for you to tell me about yourself. I'll give it my best shot, and then we can talk about it.
Sure. Thanks so much for coming in today. Akash, I'd love for you to just um I've assume I've told you a little about myself. I'd love to have just hear a little about more about you.
Absolutely. So I've spent 16 years in product management, and of course, you've seen that I've bounced around industries. I've been in B2B SaaS, I've been in e-commerce, I've been in gaming. But interestingly, I think, compared to the other candidates that you might have for this Google AdWords role, I have built ad tech both on the buy side and the sell side. And I have managed growth marketing teams that are using this technology. So let me dive into each of those 3 points. On the buy side, When I was leading growth at ThreadUp, I didn't just lead the product teams, I also led the marketing and growth marketing functions. And so I had a full-time person handling our SEM and SEO strategies. One of the things that helped get me promoted into director was building this ad tech on top of all of our channels, which was a cross-channel bidding and optimization solution. So that's why I brought the product and marketing teams together and why I led both of those and why we raised our Series C, Series D, Series E, and ultimately went public. The second side is I worked on the sell side of ad tech. So when I was head of product growth at Affirm, a public company, I was actually building the ads that show up in the Affirm app. And so I've directly worked on a product very similar to Google AdWords. Of course, our scale, 50 million versus 50 billion, there's 1,000x of learning I need to do when it comes to Google scale, but we were serving ads. And then the final thing, like I mentioned, is I don't just have that growth product background. Yes, today in my role as VP of product at Apollo, I manage a team of 15 PMs, but I've also done that growth marketing at places like ThreadUp. And I think that that gives me an edge over other folks because I'll really be able to understand our user. I myself have set up Google CPC ad campaigns, so I have a lot of ideas about how to improve them.
Thank you. Okay. So my feedback here is one thing is I think you're talking, this is going to sound a little silly, but I think you're talking a lot about yourself and your, um, here's what you bring to the table, which is great. I'd love to hear more about your passions. Why, what do you love doing? And I think you can complement your answer with just a little bit more stuff that's like, I really love doing this side of PM. I really love this aspect. That I think would make it a little bit stronger. Um, the other thing is that I didn't love the reference to other candidates. One is it can flip the interviewer immediately into this like almost not argumentative, but something like that of like, is that true? Are these my other candidates? Like, do you actually know who my other candidates are? That I don't know if you want, I don't think it's needed in your answer. You don't need to compare yourself to other people. You can just say, one of the things that I think makes me really unique is I have this. And you don't need to call out, you can just drop that little couple of words. And I think it avoids that issue. Um, yeah, and those are kind of the two big things that jump out at me. Um, I also found it a little bit um because I don't have your resume in front of me, the talking about these 3 different aspects, was a little bit confusing to me because I'm kinda like, "Okay, what's the flow?" That said, I may have felt differently if I had your resume and it was very clear to me. Um, but there may be a way of strengthening your answer with doing both of these things. So, giving a really quick walkthrough and then talking about these 3 different aspects that would then make you make be like, "Look, I'm the trifecta."
Awesome. Shall we try it again?
Sure.
All right.
Oh, actually,
So
sorry, I'll call out one more thing, which is, um, I would just avoid the phrasing of bounced around. It's negative phrasing, and I think you can still say instead say it in more like bouncing around. People don't want people heard bouncing around across jobs. And so just a little thing like use some different terminology there.
okay. Let's see if I can improve it. And by the way, for the audience, I didn't script this and I haven't interviewed in something like 3 years. All right. So I'm known for being a product growth leader on self-serve motions. I started off 16 years ago, stumbling in from software engineering to product management, where I led product growth at a small B2B SaaS company. From there, I grew to an e-commerce company, ThreadUp, which is now public. I went to Affirm, which is a public fintech company, Epic Games, which is a $30 billion gaming company. And now I'm VP of product at Apollo.io, which is a $2.5 billion SaaS company where I lead 15 PMs. And the things that I would highlight that make me so excited about this role, I think first of all, just being in my wheelhouse of self-serve growth. This is what makes me really excited is you guys have millions of advertisers signing up for Google AdWords every day. And those self-serve motions of how to ramp up those B2B customers in a B2C way, that's my expertise within product. The second thing is I've worked on both the buy side and the sell side of ad tech. On the buy side, I mentioned ThreadUp. There, I led the growth marketing teams in addition to the growth product teams. And one of the coolest things we built, in fact, we showed this off to our investors when we raised our Series D and became unicorns, was this ad tech that was sitting on top of Google and Facebook and handling our bids and budgets across channels. And on the sell side, when I was at a firm, because I was responsible for growth of the mobile app, we had so many users, over 15 million monthly active users, that we started showing ads in our app. And I built the technology behind that. And although it was only a $50 million a year business compared to $50 billion a year at Google, I also got that sell side experience. And so I think it's those combination of experiences, plus just my true belief that Google AdWords is going to continue to grow as Google evolves, that makes me really excited to chat with you today.
So I think that's great. I liked I now have a mental map of like your background, so it makes it much clearer for me. And I really liked how you integrated that sort of passion into it. One thing I think about is that the when you talked, there was a lot of this is a delicate balance for product management because it is a we sort of role. Um, but when you talked about your past, it was, a lot of it was we the company did X, Y, or Z, and I was there as a P. And you want to be careful because you don't want to come off taking all the credit for yourself. But I think there you can probably strengthen your answers by talking a little, be having a little bit more in there about I launched this, I did um, that can help. Again, you want to be careful because if you go overboard, you can come off as arrogant. But I think you can strengthen it with a little bit more accomplishments.
Awesome. So there's always room to improve. That's a little bit of a preview to you guys about how you can improve your tell me about yourself and see how by recording it even, maybe not having an expert like Gayle there, you should be able to improve your response. Let's go ahead and try the biggest weakness as well.
So tell me a bit about how do you see, understand that everyone has things to work on. What do you see as your weaknesses or growth areas?
So I know one thing about me that's probably stuck with me from my personality when I was young is I can be a little bit abrasive. And so for people with certain communication styles who don't want to talk as directly, or they want to make sure that they have to get to know me before we really hit that level, I need to be super careful. And so I'm not just aware of this in my work life, but also in my personal life. I try to mitigate this, personality trait of mine, which I think just comes from my Indian upbringing, being a first child, of being hyper consciously aware of how I'm coming off to people. Starting off meetings with a little bit of small chit chat, not immediately getting to the point if they're the type of people who would want that. So really customizing my style and then also checking myself before I send a quick Slack message, especially because that's an area I've noticed where I could be a little bit more abrasive because over video, you can see I'm smiling. I'm a pretty positive person. Nobody really finds me super abrasive, but over text, I think it's a little bit more common. And since it's so important in group product manager roles like this to have that stakeholder communication be tip top, I try to pay a lot of attention to it.
Right, so can you tell me about a time when you've run into this as a challenge?
Yeah, so just double clicking on the Slack example maybe because it's a bit burned in my memory, but I remember I was talking with my director of design at a firm. So he was managing 3 or 4 designers. I was managing 3 or 4 PMs at this time. And we had hit 2 out of our 3 OKRs, but the third OKR, we were going to have to message that basically we didn't hit it. If anything, like that metric went the opposite direction over the course of a quarter. And he had sent me a Slack message like, hey, Akash, like, what is our messaging around this? And I, trying to be super responsive, just wrote like, we completely botched the design on X feature. And he immediately felt attacked by that, right? I thought that I had said like, okay, we botched it, but then immediately I pointed the finger at design. And so I remember that because he specifically like brought me aside the next time we talked and said like, Akash, I kind of like felt like we grew a little more distant in that interaction. And so I was trying to respond fast, but actually I kind of hurt our relationship. And so those are those moments now that I try to take a breath. Just take a look at the message. Make sure that I add in 2 or 3 lines more context. Like, you and I both went to the design reviews, and I feel like maybe we didn't give the team enough time to iterate on our feedback. If I had just added in that extra line, I think he would have been okay. And so sometimes it's about pausing.
Great. So, um, what I like about this answer for you specifically, and actually I was going to call this out when I mentioned the arrogance thing, is that different people have different their weaknesses, of course, but also different sort of vibes that they give off. And so, what I like about this answer for you coming off abrasive is that you can come off abrasive is that you actually, chatting with you for the last few minutes, like I don't get an abrasive from you. And so if I had gotten this answer from somebody who my impression of them is like the kind of a jerk, this can be sort of a final nail in the it can convey sort some awareness, but it can also be like, okay, no, this is like final nail in the coffin. Like it's not just my vibe. It's like and so what I like about this is like you're not coming off as a jerk to me. And probably because you're aware of how you can come up. Um that said, like I don't know that I'd use the word abrasive. Um and because I think the other way that you phrased it is being direct. And I would just what you said in the answer was like you come off abrasive. That was the first thing you said. And then you went and explained that it's, being direct. And I would flip those and actually take out the abrasiveness. So, I'd say, I think one of the things I'm working on still is that can I can come off very direct. And this is why. Um and I don't think in this case you need to say abrasive. I think that's too damning. And I'm also not sure it really is abrasive. I think it actually probably is direct. Abrasiveness to me is something more than just being direct. Um, and then on the I kind of tried to catch you off guard to ask it for a time. Um, when you went into the answer about a situation, I thought you gave a lot of context before getting to the point was not really like you gave a lot of context about the OKRs and this and that. And really the gist of the story is somebody asked you how something was going and you said something very um, all the stuff about hitting these other OKRs, like it's really part of the story. And so I would understand in your stories what is actually the point of this story and just get to that. And this is a really common mistake. A lot of people give too much text.
Today's episode is brought to you by Gibson AI, the future of backend development. Imagine designing, deploying, and scaling your database as effortlessly as having a conversation. With Gibson AI, that's now a reality. Gibson AI is your AI-powered database engineer. In just minutes, you can chat with Gibson to create production-grade data models, deploy them on Gibson's cloud infrastructure, and instantly generate secure REST APIs. Connect your frontend directly to your Gibson-built database, or drop the API specs into Cursor, vZero, or Bolt to build a full-stack application seamlessly. From idea stage to millions of users, Gibson scales with you. Gibson optimizes your database as you grow and enables easy schema updates and migrations. So head over to gibsonai.com/Aakash. That's GIBSONAI.com/AAKASH to sign up for free and experience the future of automated data modeling. Awesome. I think a lot of people can benefit from that, and hopefully you all practice more than I did. I did those off the cuff. So, what are the other behavioral interview questions people should be preparing for?
One of so some of the common questions are things that are just like, and I would encourage people to have answers for, successes, challenges, times when they hit obstacles, prioritization things, and so leadership impact, some of the sort of big umbrella things. And then what I encourage people to do is really look at what that role is, really prepare specific to the company. And there's a lot of course, overlap across companies, but look at the job descriptions and look at like what kind of PM are they trying to hire? Is this more data driven? Is this more of a big visionary role? What is they actually trying to hire for? And then I would also look at the companies if they have leadership values, et cetera, corporate values online. That is often that often is infused into their interview process, and so I would prepare based on those. Um, but yeah, some really common stuff is like be able to talk about things like your greatest successes, which it seems so easy, but in some ways, because it's something that everybody should have an answer to, it's the stakes get raised a little bit because everybody can give an answer and you want to give something that's really a great answer.
What about this question? And I reckon it might be the second most common that I personally get is why do you want to work here? Or why this role? Or why do you want to work at this company? How should you answer that question?
Great question. So, again, in going back to doing interviewer trainings, one of the things I ask interviewers is like, are you asking that question? If so, what are you looking for? And what's What's interesting is that, again, there's a little bit of a lack of consistency, and what it tells me is that a lot of interviewers are asking this without a without really often articulating, like, "What am I actually trying to get out of this?" Um, but the overarching thing is that people, for particularly for PMs, especially as they get more senior, what the most common thing is that they want an answer that shows that you are serious about your career, that you are not applying at random, that you have put some into what is it that you're actually looking for. So in some ways, it's kind of a weird answer because it's like you should have something interesting to say here, and it kind of doesn't matter too much what it is, but you should have something you try to focus on something positive. Like it in a lot of ways, one of the concerns I have with this question is when I think about training people on this is that there is this mismatch when you talk to somebody about, why'd you leave your last job? Why'd you go from A to B? Their answer is usually something actually negative about what they're leaving. And yet when you give an answer to employers, it's something positive. And like there's a reason for that. You should be positive. You should have something that you are seeking from that company. Um, and it might be an opportunity to work on something specific. It could be taking a particular step in your career. It could be something about the company. There's a lot of different ways of answering the question. And the most important thing is that you have an answer that's interesting. And it's not so much what that answer is, that you have something that's interesting, and avoid things about like commute. Things that don't say anything special about you or the company. You want to give something that's specific to that company, but it doesn't really matter all that much.
Yeah, what I found as an interviewer, having interviewed a lot of directors and senior directors in my most recent role, is it's a really good way to get rid of the people who just haven't done enough work. Like, if they haven't used the product, if they haven't tried out and understood our key user segment, if they like at Apollo, our user segment, it's sales teams. If they start talking about how we can help marketing teams, then they haven't understood our key user segment. And so, do they understand our ICP? Do they understand our product? And also, do they understand kind of what stage of company we are? Because as a PM, when I was at a $2.5 billion company versus a $30 billion company, it was so different. And so, are they ready for the type of company you are? What about all the rest of the long list of 100 of behavioral interview questions someone might answer? Do you like the STAR framework? Do you have like an overall approach to handling the long tail of behavioral questions?
Yeah, I mean, so there are actually multiple. There's matrices that I like, and there's three of them. And so the first thing I want people to think about so there's sort of two stages of this. And one is how do you figure out what the stuff is you should be talking about? And then how do you, in other words, how do you figure out the content? How do you figure out the communications? So Star Framework, it's a classic. It's a classic for a reason. I also think it's a little bit incomplete. And we'll talk about that. But yeah, Star Framework, great. Um, but I think the first thing is with preparing, especially, is the content side. And so what I encourage people to do is actually two different ways. You want to think about like story generation, and there's actually two different ways of generating stories. One is, okay, when I think about my background, the things that I've done, what are the major sort of chunks that jump out? That may be products you've worked on. If you're less experienced, it can be, particularly if you're just out of college, it may be for projects, internships. Um, in some cases, sometimes it could even be something outside of work, outside of school. But what are the big chunks of your resume? And then what are the stories that jump out at you? Like, oh, I started this thing, I led this new initiative, etc. So, what are those big chunks? And that's one way of generating stories. Do that. Also, do this other way of generating stories, which is going from the signal to the story. So, I talked earlier about the importance of thinking about signal. So, signal is not, is this story good or bad? It's, what am I learning about you? And it comes back to actually your strengths and weaknesses, I suppose. So one of the things I encourage people to do is, as they're preparing, is look up a list online of strengths and weaknesses. There's one in Cracking the PM interview as well. Look up a list of strengths and weaknesses, or come up on your own with what are the couple strengths and weaknesses that you, and then use that actually to think about stories. So for me, one of my strengths is I have a lot of initiative. And so when I think about that, I can think, okay, what are the stories that from my background that demonstrate initiative? And what's really nice about that is that these are the stories that when you tell them to an interviewer, they're going to lead very naturally to selling a very particular message about you, which ultimately is what your interviewer should be doing, is understanding, who you are and what makes you tick and what are the things you're bringing to the table. And so when you start with the signal and then you think about what stories demonstrate that, it's is generally a very good selling point for that signal. So do sort of both sides of that preparation with the content of going, what are the major chunks of your resume to the stories from that? And then what are the signals about you that you want to demonstrate? And then what stories demonstrate? And then you have these list of stories that you come up with different ways. And then you want to think about structuring your answer. So STAR framework, it's the classic. I also I said that it's incomplete because what I think it's missing is the signal piece, that that too many times people just say, oh, here's a situation, here's a problem I had to solve, I did X, Y, or Z. And often those stories are sort of they're missing the signal, they're missing the selling point. And I walk away being like, okay, that was cool, but I don't really learn that you're empathetic. I don't learn that you're data driven. I don't learn anything about you. So yes, use the STAR framework, but you need to be thinking in your preparation about, like, what are the signals that this story can sell? And then you're going to change your story based on what it is you're actually trying to sell.
Perfect. The other element of interviews, of course, behavioral questions are big, but especially if we're talking about a big tech company, most of your interviews are actually these case interviews. And the most common case interview these days, the product design case interview. Design a pencil for the blind, design a piece of software for a specific user segment. How should people handle these product design case interview questions?
Yeah. Um, so I like to go back to signal. Okay. So what is our interviewer trying to measure with that? Because we want to make sure that we are demonstrating that. I think that's where a lot of candidates go wrong, is that they use these frameworks and they lose sight of, like, what is my interviewer actually trying to validate? So with the product design question, what your interviewer is looking for is empathy for users, prioritization. It depends a bit on the company, the team, et cetera. Structure, things like that. And so when you give your answer, you want to make sure that you are demonstrating those attributes about yourself. And so with the product design question, first thing I like to think about is, okay, have some, and this may be implicit in the question, may not, but have some idea of, like, why are we doing this? So if we're designing a pencil for the blind, a calculator for the blind, a lot of times it's these disabilities. But have some idea of, like, are we talking about actually launching something? Are we a company what are we actually going for? What are our constraints? Is this I'm going to build the coolest product ever, or do we have some constraints here? So figuring out, and then we want to make sure that we are checking that box of, I am a PM who thinks about the user. And so don't lose sight of that at any point, but a lot of that comes in the beginning, but it's also throughout. So, common mistakes are that you haven't really given thought um, to who the user is. And so, um, questions about, let's say we're talking about designing a calculator for kids. Well, that's actually really, or pen for kids. Like that's actually a really broad thing. It's also a little bit unfair because it biases for people who have kids who know more about kids. But you need to be thinking about, what age kids, where are they using that? Why are they doing this? Why are we building this? Designing a calculator for 3-year-olds is a wildly different thing than for 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 15-year-olds. And so really making sure that you are putting that into understanding the user, understanding their needs. And, you know, sometimes what happens is people think about their very explicit needs. Well, they need this, this, and this feature. And sometimes they lose track of other users and other needs. So other users might be if it's a product for a person with this for this type of person. There may be other stakeholders. So if you're designing for kids, you may be designing for teachers and parents. If you're designing for people with certain disabilities, you may be designing for caretakers. If you're designing for elderly, you're probably designing for caretakers as well. And so making sure you're thinking about those different users and then thinking about implicit needs as well. People may have a need to fit in, to blend in. If you're designing a calculator for somebody who is blind and you're relying potentially heavily on audio feedback, like they probably don't want a whole bunch of beeps going off in class. So are you thinking about need to blend in to fit in? Are you thinking about if you're designing for kids, are you thinking about safety? Right. So making sure you're thinking about these, the explicit needs, but also these implicit needs. And then you're designing the actual features that help support those needs and figuring out how do you prioritize those different needs, particularly if we start talking about companies having constraints, different goals, for a company designing with different goals a company may have, and maybe it's profit, maybe it's revenue, maybe it's initial traction, et cetera.
What are the other major case questions people should be preparing for?
So okay, so there's case questions, of course, that are product design questions. One of the things I like to call out here is that there can be case there can be product design questions that sometimes people miss that are product design questions. And so just be careful for these kind of hidden product design questions. So for example, like how would you improve the US Postal Service? Sometimes people like hear a question like that and they miss that this is actually a product question. And so just be aware of um and similarly, and there's really a whole spectrum of these. There's questions about improving, talking about your favorite product is another type of question that you want to, that all sort of relate to this sort of product design question, your favorite product, being prepared for the favorite product your favorite product from that company, or talking about what that team's product is. So just be aware that there is this sort of broad umbrella of product questions. So that's one. And then there's other questions that are about particular problems. So we launched X, Y, or Z feature and this metric dropped. What would you do? And so you want to be aware of those kind of questions. And then there's more silly questions about more brainstorming. How many different ways are there of using, or find all the different ways of using a paper, which are a bit silly to me. But there's those kind of questions as well. But an overarching idea of a lot of case questions is uh, going back to this idea of what is your interviewer actually. At the end of the day, your interviewer is trying to evaluate you and they're trying to measure certain things about you. And theoretically, all these questions are about that. And so when in doubt, fall back to, okay, your interviewer wants to know that you are a type of person who doesn't make assumptions and run with them, because that's a pretty dangerous thing for a PM. And so show your interviewer that you're a person who can address ambiguity, ask questions, understand that. Show your interviewer that you're a person who thinks about the user. And so when you're talking about, you know, this, we launched this thing, this problem, and what would you do? You can demonstrate certainly asking questions during that. And there may be times that ways that you are demonstrating user empathy. And so make sure that you're doing and showing sort of some um collaboration can be important as well. Depends on the exact question being asked. Certainly, collaboration with your interviewer will be a piece as well. Um, and then figuring out how do you prioritize, execute, et cetera. That's another big sort of bucket of things you might be looking for in these questions.
That's what I wanted to ask about next because I've seen a huge growth in these execution related questions. The most common is, hey, you're the PM of driver growth at Uber. We see a 17% drop in bookings yesterday. What do you do? How do you handle these cases?
Okay, great. So I understand. So I'm overseeing driver growth, and we're seeing a drop in bookings yesterday. Okay, so what questions come to my mind here? So one thing I'd want to know is things like, um, was this d- did anything? So first, I want to know is like, is this something to worry about? What is driver growth actually? What are we actually measuring here? Um, is this figure out if there's a sometimes people ask questions and really the net of it is this actually isn't a problem. This was on a Monday, and actually Monday is actually typically a 25% drop. So actually things went great. Um, and so asking these kind of questions to figure out like what is the scale of the problem? What is actually going on here? So ask maybe questions about sort of the history of this, what changed, et cetera, but making sure you understand what the problem is going to be the very, very, very first thing to do. Not only because you need to have these answers in order to tackle the question, but because this is one of the buckets is, did my candidate ask appropriate questions? Did they resolve ambiguity? They just run with this and say, okay, I'm going to change X, Y, or Z thing. Um, so starting with those questions is going to be the very, very, very first thing to do. Um, and then you're going to want to think, are there ways of sort of blending in, demonstrating this sort of user empathy side, which maybe not yet, but it might be there depending on the exact question. And then you're going to go through what are some experiments you might run. How would you actually solve this? What I would not discourage people from doing, but discourage people from relying on too much is sometimes I hear people give answers that are like, well, I would turn to basically I would um run this or this experiment and then that's it. Or I would go and talk to X, Y, or Z person. And it's this answer that's like basically I I'm not going to continue to engage in your problem solving because like this is the first thing I would do and then I'm done. And interviewers are the reason why I say I wouldn't discourage people from doing that entirely is that sometimes interviewers actually want to see like in the real world, the person would do XYZ. They would go run this experiment and then see what happens from there. But usually your interviewers want to see more than that. So, okay, you'd run this experiment. And then what? Based on this data, what would you do depending on what the results are? And so making sure you're continuing to take that next step. And when in doubt, remember that and this is a really important thing for people to understand in these interviews is that these are dialogues. When we give interview advice, we're talking about, for the most part, typical interviewers. Some interviewers do weird things, silly things, stupid things, really smart things that come off weird at first. This is a dialogue with your interviewer. And so if you're not sure if they want you to go down some path, like you can talk to them and you can ask them. I'd run this experiment to figure out, was it this or this? Do you want me to go more into what I would do depending on these results? And you can have that conversation with your interviewer. You don't have to guess that much what they're looking for.
The other category of case questions I've seen growing is this strategy category. There are many subsets under the strategy category, but the most common question is like, you're the CEO of YouTube. What are you going to do for the next 5 years? How should you answer these case questions?
What is ambiguous here? What are the questions? Right. What you don't want to do is dive into like, oh, I'd like that. They should do X, Y, or Z. So you need to start with what are the problems they're having right now, and what are their goals? And this is one of these things where we don't really know what our interviewers expecting here. How much of our own insight do they want us to bring? And we don't really know because it actually depends. Those sort of that a question like that is probably going to be asked probably going to ask for somebody a little bit more senior, though not necessarily. So what would we, if I were CEO of Google, what would of YouTube, what would I do? Um, well, do we have the information about key problems, or do you want me to kind of explore what their problems are? And the feedback from the interviewer is often going to be, I'd love to hear your insight about what the biggest problems are. Um, and say, okay, so where do we go from there? Well, let's think about breaking down whether we're trying to think about, monetization, user growth. So my experience with YouTube is they have a large number of, users. User growth is probably not going to be a really big thing. They're already sort of the staple. What we're probably going to want to think about is revenue, specifically, and most specifically profit. Does that, align with you? Okay, great. So if we want to think about profit, so what we can do here is we can demonstrate our ability to break down a problem and strategize. Uh, and so, we're not just saying, okay, here, I want to do X, Y, Z feature, but here's how I'm going to break down the problem. Here are the different ways we can evolve the product. There's user growth, there's revenue slash profit, obviously different things, but revenue and profit. There's growing into different markets, et cetera. And so asking questions, addressing anything, and frankly, looking for things that are ambiguous and using your interviewer's answers as guides to help you then figure out how to break down that.
We've covered all of the most important interview topics as I would formulate them, so I hope that gives everybody a really good preparation framework. I told this story to Gayle off air. I used to listen to her talk for the product school on 2X as I was driving to interviews. So that's my hope with this resource here. We just gave you a little tour on all the top questions, and this can be something you can listen to on the way to your interviews. Now I want to talk a little bit about getting those interviews in the first place, because I talk to job seekers every day, and a lot of them are actually stuck at getting interviews. Their spray and pray approaches aren't working. Even their referrals are falling flat. How do you get interviews in 2025?
Yeah, it's tough, and um, it's tough. The job market is not great, and there are a lot of product managers out there. Unfortunately, and a lot of people trying to break into product management. Um, so I think you can apply online. I it doesn't work super well. I wouldn't say don't do it per se, because I think you have to make your own time management trade-offs. I'd say it doesn't work very well. It's also fairly cheap and easy to do. That said, over time, I think it's going to it doesn't work now, and it's going to get to really, 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 really never working, because for better or worse, AI tools are popping up to allow people to spray their resume everywhere. And it's going to basically it's going to make the online job application really, truly, totally useless. Um, but if you want to spend your time doing that, that's you can use if you have really the best way to. There's sort of two ways of thinking. There's a sort of a framework of how to think about getting a job, getting an interview. And it's actually very similar to launching products and growing, but it's okay. You have to get that awareness. You have to get somebody to you have to get in touch with somebody. You have to get them to look at your resume, and then you have to get them to sort of take action. And that, when you think about the sort of getting them interested once they look at your resume, that's going to be a lot about your prior experience. That's going to be about making sure your resume, what you're trying to sell about your resume, and making sure your resume highlights those things. Where people are really, really struggling is that awareness piece. How do you get somebody to actually look at your resume in the first place? Um, and referrals are going to be the way, are going to be the way to do that. If you have contacts within the company, people you've worked with in particular, people who can speak to you, fantastic, use those. That's going to be sort of your first line, but at the end of the day, you don't have that many contacts there. And so that you don't have that many sort of first degree contacts who can vouch for you. At that point, you're going to be talking about second degree contacts, in which case they're not able to vouch for you. What they can do is forward your resume and something like that. And so, use those opportunities, but really what you're going to be doing a lot of is direct reach. So, um, I actually just launched a new book and we talk called Beyond. It's for coders, not for product managers, but it does go into a lot of stuff about how do you get somebody to look at your resume? And it's about direct outreach at this point. So, um, what we recommend you do is make a list of your targets. So, who are you actually trying to talk to? What are all the companies? And then find people in the company. If they are second degree, first degree, even better. But if they have second degree connection, even better. That's amazing. But you may go further out there. You may have no line into the company. And then you're going to be trying to track down those hiring managers directly and finding common ground with them. That may be something, a podcast they recorded. It may be um a, a you went to the same college, it may be finding common ground might be about something that you've done that they've done that overlaps in some way. And you got to do that direct outreach. And it's hard and it's time consuming and it's a bit soul crushing because you're doing so much of this and it doesn't so much of it will not pan out. But there's, in this job market, there's really no great alternative. And other than there are few referrals that you can get, like it's going to be that direct outreach and making it some hiring managers and, finding that kind of shared relationship, that shared touch point with them, and then doing that outreach, writing them emails. You can often find corporate emails or guess them, or you might be able to find personal email as an alternative.
Yes, you can find corporate emails using that tool I worked for, Apollo.io. We have 50 free emails a month, so check that out. And I got my last, I guess, 4 jobs all from inbound. How do you create that inbound engine of people coming to you?
Getting those is a bit about your, things that are kind of unchangeable in the short term in terms of like, what's your pedigree? Where have you worked and what have you done? And then it's also about making yourself available. So make sure that you have a LinkedIn profile, of course. If you have a website, if you can, you know, get something up there with basically a resume so that you can be findable. And then the more that you can do to put yourself out there, the better. So can you be active online in some way in product communities? If you can be on podcasts and things like that, creating as much awareness of yourself as you can is gonna be really helpful. And that sort of awareness, if you can create a little bit of awareness for you, that can also compensate if you don't have a good college or a good past employer behind you. That can also help sort of compensate by being like, okay, look, here's what I do, here's how I think about product, here, writing about product online, those sort of things can help that awareness as well.
So you and we've probably seen thousands of PM resumes at this point. What are the most common things you find yourself repeating about, hey, change this in your resume?
So, the most common thing is understanding really, really solidifying. Look, a lot of people probably have heard this advice, but really understanding people are not reading your resume, they are skimming. What you are looking for is somebody saying yes after glancing for 10, 15, 20 seconds at your resume. And so how are you going to sell yourself? Um, you know, we've probably heard, most people probably heard, like, don't have your resume be super long. And it's worth people understanding why that is. And it's because of this skimming. When you, when your resume is 3 pages, even if you have a lot of experience and you can really fill up 3 pages, that means that some great accomplishment might be on page 2 and somebody just doesn't notice it. Um, so really making sure you know what it is that you are trying to sell about yourself. If you have worked for a well-known company, that like I always laugh when I see these resumes that, for product managers and they have, columns and it's product manager company and, the dates and like their job titles bolded and not the fact that they worked for Google. I'm like, that's the thing you want to sell is the Google thing. So just like basic cosmetic things of a well-organized resume, keep it short because the if you only have a really short amount of time for someone to look at your resume, The shorter your resume is, the more likely they are to see the stuff you really want to sell and know what those things are you're trying to sell. Uh, and then there's all that other advice about, making sure your resume is, use metrics, et cetera. That stuff is true. Um, it's realistically like in 30 seconds, people probably aren't reading a ton of your bullets, but you do want to keep those bullets fairly short. Um, your bullets should be a mix of 1 or 2 lines, not all single line and not all 2 lines. Rarely anything more than 2 lines, but keep those bullets short. But really focus on what are you actually trying to tell me about yourself? And, make sure that those are the things that people jump out at you. And actually one exercise you can do is like print out your resume, give it to a friend, preferably somebody who doesn't know you super, super well, and have them like highlight key things in 10, 15 seconds and see what they actually notice about you. It often won't be some, bullet that you spend a ton of, people will spend a ton of time like finessing the word on some bullet. And it's like, that's fine, but people probably won't read that anyway. Like, spend the time, but you really want to make sure it's more about structure, organization, making sure that the selling points jump people.
And I always tell people they've done eye tracking studies on how people read resumes and they read in an F pattern. So get that top left really good. So we have covered how to crack the PM interview, how to get the PM interview. I want to hear a little bit about you. You're a famous book author. Most PMs have heard your name before, but they're wondering, what are you up to now? How are you making money now? What does that pie chart of Gayle's revenue look like today?
Yeah. So, what I do is I sort of specialize in interviewing, but I'm actually on both sides of the table. So, yes, there's the book. So, cracking the PM interview, cracking the PM career, which came out a couple of years, 2, 3 years ago, maybe something like, which is a really great deep dive into like not just how do you get the interview, but like how do you be a great PM and how do you think about your career as a PM? So it's a really comprehensive book on the art of product management. So there's that. Not as interesting probably to most people you're listening to this, but I also just came out with a new book called Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview, which is essentially a sequel to my sort of initial book, which is Cracking the Coding Interview. So there's a book side. And then a lot of what I do now, in addition to the books, is I do consulting. So I work with tech companies, a lot of the times larger tech companies and sometimes non-tech companies and sometimes smaller companies on their hiring process. So, we have, worked with companies like Uber when they're kind of like every team is doing a different thing, and I'll come in there and start consolidating the process, making it more standardized, and then actually doing the interviewer trainings as well. And so I'd say it varies, pie chart varies year to year, but typically, barring that there really is no typical, I'd say probably income is probably 60-70% books and the remainder consulting.
Thank you for that. People are always wondering how book authors are doing, so it's always interesting to hear where your focus is now. If people enjoyed this conversation, where can they find you online and do more?
Yeah, so I'm on a lot of the major platforms. Usually my username got the username Gayle, Gayle, because nobody is naming people Gayle these days. It's kind of the name of a 70, 80-year-old woman at this point in time. So creates a lot of availability for usernames. So I'm on, I think actually LinkedIn is one I didn't get that. LinkedIn, I think I got Gayle McD, but on Twitter and a bunch of the kind of major platforms with that.
Gayle, ever since I bought this book a long time ago, I've been wanting to chat with you. This is a bit of a dream come true. Thank you.
All right. Well, it's great chatting with you as well.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find out about the podcast. You can find all the past episodes or learn more about the show at product-growth.com. See you in the next episode.